Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. In this episode, I'm exploring a subject we'll all be familiar with, conflict. On the face of it, it's something we ought to try and avoid. So when I tell you that my guest Ian Leslie has just written a book which promotes the idea of conflict as a positive force, you might rightly be confused. But bear with me, because what Ian has to say is fascinating. What he shares in his book, Conflicted: Why Arguments Are Tearing Us Apart and How They Can Bring Us Together, are some incredible insights about human decision-making. In Conflicted, he explores how conflict is the secret of happy relationships, the way companies can build collaborative cultures, and what lies behind some of the greatest scientific and creative breakthroughs. Ian's first career was in advertising as a creative strategist for some of the world's largest brands at ad agencies in London and New York. Nowadays, he's a writer and author of acclaimed books on human behaviour. He's also got a wonderful newsletter. I'll remind you about that at the end. For now, settle in for what seems like a counterintuitive topic. But as you'll hear, Ian is engaging, smart, and above all, convincing. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you a favour. If you like the show and haven't yet left a 5-star review for it on whichever platform you're using, please do so. It makes a huge difference and allows me to continue to attract high-quality guests like Ian. If you don't like the show, then email me and let me know how we can make it better. Because, as you're about to hear, we all need a little conflict and challenge in our lives. So please enjoy my discussion with Ian Leslie on conflict. Ian, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you, Christian. It's very good to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. And look, I was musing to myself about how I would introduce you. And it sort of seemed to me that if I had to pick a label, I would call you an explainer. And I wondered how you would describe yourself to my listeners.
You know, I am quite prepared for you to come up with your own label, because I'm not necessarily the best judge of it. But yeah, I'm a writer. My first career, by the way, was in advertising. And then I had a kind of a premature midlife crisis, some point in my 30s, and decided that I wanted to be a writer too. And since then, I've published a few books, and the way it works is, well, I guess first of all, you would say they're very roughly in the kind of genre that Malcolm Gladwell opened up about 20 years ago, where you can write about ideas and talk to scientists and experts, but make it very accessible and interesting to the general reader. And what I tend to do is take an aspect of human nature, human behavior, that I think is generally looked at kind of the wrong way, and say, hey, we need to rethink about this very familiar aspect of our nature and look at it in a different way. And here's why. So I wrote a book about lying called Born Liars: Why We Can't Live Without Deceit, which argued that lying and deception and self-deception are actually much more central to our life than we think. And I wrote a book about curiosity and the power and the trait of curiosity, and why we kind of undervalue it and underestimate it. And the latest book is about, which I'm sure we'll get onto, is about argument and disagreement, and why there are actually huge benefits of argument and disagreement that we are not currently getting enough of. So yeah, I explainer is good. I'm not an expert myself. I don't have a PhD. I'm not a scientist or a psychologist. But I talk to lots of people who are, and then I talk to lots of different kinds of experts from different fields, and then I kind of bring it all together with stories. So I'm an explainer, and also I think a kind of translator or kind of joiner together of different fields, and say, look, there's lots of analogous stuff going on here from all these different fields. Let's bring them together to tell a bigger story.
And there's a lovely line in your latest book, and I can't remember exact words, but it basically said, I'm intrigued by this, and I didn't get satisfactory answers, so I thought I'd do some more research, which I just thought was a really, really a brilliant excuse, if you like, for diving into these things.
Yeah, I think that's really how the idea for a book comes, or no, the idea can come, but then the idea is only going to stick around for a long time if I'm not satisfied that I have an answer. So sometimes I'll come up with an idea for a book, and then after thinking about it for a few weeks, I'll say, yeah, I actually think I understand this. And it's not that interesting. People have solved for this already. But if it hangs around long enough to become an actual book, it's because I'm not satisfied with the answers that people are currently giving.
And so there's a gap for you to fill, if you like. There isn't another book that's been written on this subject that answers the question in the way that. So it might do it scientifically, but actually for something that the man or woman in the street would be able to get their hands around.
Yeah, although it's not just that the man or woman can get it. It's more like nobody's looked at it quite this way before. So, So for this new one, which is about argument and disagreement and the sort of principles of good disagreement, there were some books which look at it, but they tend to focus on there's quite a lot of stuff about the ancient Greek principles of good argument and debate. Quite a lot of Latin. Now, all that stuff is interesting. Some of that is in the book, but I felt that it left out the relationship dimension of the kind of more emotional dimension of disagreement. The reason we find it so hard and so uncomfortable. How do you deal with that as well? So I want to look at it, intellectually, but I also want to look at it emotionally. I want to look at it in the round.
What I loved about the book is you sort of start off by saying you talk about why do we have arguments, and even the word argument I thought was interesting, because on the one hand it's the word that we use to support, it sits with logic. What is your argument? On the other hand, it's a really negative thing. We've just had an argument. Doesn't ever sound like it's something good. And so you start off by looking at sort of the dynamic of why this happens. And what particularly fascinates me, you draw out that point that says this is happening more often and is going to happen more often. And I wonder if you could just unpick that a little bit for the listeners and just sort of explain what your thesis is there.
Yes. So my basic kind of overall thesis is that we're living in a world now which is more primed for disagreement and instant disagreement and conflict and difficulty than ever before. And we're not remotely prepared for it, right? Neither evolution nor our culture has prepared us or trained us in how to disagree well. And there's a lot of disagreements going on, or a lot of potential disagreements. And so there's a couple of reasons for that. One, your listeners can probably guess is the internet technology and social media, which is a very public source of really bad disagreements. And that's what got me started thinking about this was, why are there so many futile, toxic arguments on social media, and also just in our politics generally, right? Just in the public sphere generally. But I don't think it's all to do with technology. I do talk about that in the book, but I also say this is actually a much deeper rooted historical trend, and technology, the internet, is just sort of amplifying and exacerbating it. For most of human history, to have an opinion on something was not such a big deal. You didn't really need to have opinions, and you didn't really need to disagree, right? So I'm kind of wildly exaggerating, but just to give you a kind of broad sketch, tradition and hierarchy told you basically what your view was and what your role was in life, and there were really a kind of narrow kind of band of things on which you were expected to have a point of view and to be able to argue about. Now that's just much less likely to be true, whatever country you're in, right? And different cultures are at different stages here. Some are more egalitarian and combative, if you like, than others. But all around the world, just because of the kind of the way that history and the economy has developed, you are seeing we created this world in which everybody has a voice. Everybody's expected to speak their mind. And now with the internet, you can do that instantly and globally and impulsively. And I think as a species, we're just completely at sea with this. We're like, wow, this is really exciting and sort of thrilling and great, because, it's a much more diverse kind of set of voices than we've ever had before, which is brilliant. But on the other hand, gosh, this is hard. And when we disagree, we tend to get these horrible arguments. And so most of us either do it badly and just, upset a lot of people, or the deeper problem is that we avoid it altogether. So I started off thinking that toxic disagreement was the main problem here. Now I think that actually the main problem is avoidance. And that because disagreement makes us feel stressed and uncomfortable, and scared that we're gonna do damage to our relationship or to our own status, we avoid it much more often than we should. So my mission really is to help people get more comfortable with disagreement, and that means kind of giving them the tools and the skills to do it well.
And it's fascinating you're talking, because I was sort of thinking, well, as things like education and data and information is becoming more freely available to people, what we're doing in many respects is teaching people skills to allow them to have the thoughts. And then, as you rightly point out, what do you do with those? Well, the answer is they become something. They become opinions and views on things that you might want to express. And so, just at the point we've got all this stuff bubbling up in our minds, so these ideas of things and inspirations, we lack the skills to be able to communicate them. And so that seemed to me, as I was reading the book, sort of that deals with the frustration, is that we haven't learnt the art and the manner with which to express ourselves. So it sits bottled up inside us, and we know that things that bottle up inside us, that's not a good thing. We need an outlet for it. It struck me that you were sort of starting a journey of saying, actually, let's just help you. You need a release valve almost for this stuff, and let's help you have a release valve that works.
Yeah, exactly. And the benefit of releasing it is not just a benefit to you, right? It's a benefit to the group. And so a lot of the time in the book, I'm thinking from the group perspective and how that's different from the individual perspective. If you have a group of people around a table, literally or figuratively, and they all have different insights and experiences and ideas and views. And the more diverse the set of people around the table, the better, right? In every sense. Culturally, religiously, ethnically, but also cognitively, right? However, if you got this incredibly diverse, smart, interesting group of people sitting around the table, and they all agree with each other, because they're all a little bit uncomfortable about disagreeing or putting too strong a point of view forward, then it's completely wasted. All this diversity is wasted. And you're not unlocking the power of bringing of that group, right? The collective intelligence of that group. And the fact is that disagreement and debate and whatever you want to call it is the best way of thinking that we have, right? We have evolved and sort of grown up as thinkers who think together. Thinking and reasoning and decision making are really kind of best done in groups. There are social activities. But unless that involves a way of kind of handling different points of view well, and it's never going to be as powerful as it should be.
And I was thinking, as you were talking just then around, why is that? Well, it occurs to me that all of the sort of cognitive biases that drive our own individual thinking, confirmation bias being a really, really good example, tend towards sort of doubling down on what we know already and sort of cognitive laziness, for want of a better phrase. And so how do we get those alternative perspectives? Well, the answer is we can't carry them in our heads necessarily. So we bring them in from other people. Is that sort of how you see it?
Yeah, I mean, this is super interesting, the topic of confirmation bias, because confirmation bias, right? Which let's just sort of restate what it is. It's being motivated to only think about evidence and reasons which support what you already believe, right? And kind of instinctively downplaying or ignoring anything that contradicts, right? And so it's a very kind of skewed, or as we say, biased kind of form of thinking. But that rather kind of begs the question, which is, how did we end up like that, right? If you're going to, we evolved as creatures who can reason better than other species. So why did we evolve in this kind of like screwed up way? And in the book, I look at this psychologists who come up with a really interesting answer to that, which actually makes intuitive sense to me, which is that, if you look at it, if you're thinking about the individual, confirmation bias is a flaw. It's a big problem, right? You're not going to be able to see the world straight if you're only kind of looking for stuff that you already believe. And you can discount for that to some extent as an individual. So if you know about it, you can kind of fight against it all the time. But if you look at it in the context of a group, like the kind of figurative group around the table that I was just talking about, all these different people with different views and different experiences, it's actually not a bug anymore. It becomes a feature, right? As long as there are certain conditions here, right? People have to be listening to each other, have to be kind of set of rules and so on. But if you then have a group of people who are all motivated to put their point of view in the best way they can, then you have a kind of Darwinian process of variation and selection going on, right? People are throwing out arguments and reasons for my point of view, and they're looking to knock down the arguments of the other side. And so in the discussion, the weak arguments and the weak reasons very quickly get weeded out and thrown out. All right, that's not going to do. That's not going to work. And only the kind of strongest arguments will survive. So actually, you can get to a really good, thoroughly interrogated, thought through argument in a group much faster when everybody is motivated only to kind of do their own thing, to make their own case. As long as there's some flexibility, right? If people just completely never move at all, then you won't actually get to an answer. But you see that the principle that actually, in an individual it's a problem. Bring people together in a group, and suddenly it's this kind of like engine of the debate, which gets you to more interesting and more powerful case arguments much more quickly.
You talk there sort of about, providing people sort of behave in the right way. So providing they're open-minded and they're not pig-headed and it sort of occurred to me that in many respects, and this is a point you really pull out in the book, is sort of we allow emotion to get in the way. And so arguments often become, I need to win this argument, and by default, they need to lose it. And that's how we feel good about ourselves. So the rules, if you like, that would allow that Darwinian structure to operate are often undermined by that emotional piece that we bring along, which is sort of, I have to be right and I have to win. And for me to win, they have to lose.
I think that's right, with a caveat that I don't want emotion to be removed from disagreements necessarily. And in fact, if you think about the way that kind of discussion, that theoretical discussion where everybody's motivated to put their own point of view, right? That's a fundamentally emotional point. Right? I want to make the best case I can here, right? So you can have emotion, right? And actually, we think better when we're throwing ourselves into an argument, right? Heart and soul. I actually don't think we should think of ourselves as kind of logic machines. We just take all the logic out and see what happens. By the way, this is a bit of a tangent, but I was just reading a biography of the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was a logician, right? And he and Bertrand Russell used to have these arguments when Wittgenstein was basically kind of a student, and Russell was his mentor, and they would be in Russell's rooms in Oxford. I think it was Oxford. And they would have these arguments about the most incredibly abstract matters of mathematical logic, right? It doesn't get any more dry theoretical than arguing about whether P plus Q it means the set of all P, Q. I don't know, but I don't even begin to grasp it. But what's really exciting about the way they describe these arguments, because Russell wrote a diary, is that they were incredibly emotional. And they were making great breakthroughs in this field, by the way, as they were having these arguments. They were disagreeing with each other about mathematical logic, and they loved it. And the descriptions of Wittgenstein being angry and frustrated and sometimes being heartbroken, these were volatile, emotional arguments. And at the same time, they were just working on these incredibly abstract problems and making a lot of progress. So I just think it's a great kind of little example of how, emotion actually can drive intellectual progress, right? It's not a kind of thing that gets in the way. However, back to your point, Yeah, I do think that you have to self-manage and kind of find a way to control it. And a lot of the book is about that, right? If the emotion, if your kind of opinion gets so identified with your self-image and your status in the group, then you will just basically argue anything, any way you want to preserve your face, preserve your status in the group. And that's when things go wrong. And basically, one of the main ways, if not the main way, that disagreements go wrong is that they become status battles, in which we're no longer really arguing about the thing that we're meant to be arguing about. We're just trying to show who's the strongest person here, who's the most important person here, who's going to dominate who. And so a big kind of part of your job as a productive disagreeer is to stop that happening, not just in yourself, but can you find a way to get the other person to lower their defenses? All right. Can you find a way to make them feel less acutely the pressure to project status and strength? And that's a really kind of interesting challenge.
And I thought one of the things that's fascinating about the book is the examples you go through. I mean, you've got the Beatles in there, you've got hostage negotiators, you've got some more recent sort of what are loosely termed sort of Black Lives Matter topics. I mean, it's a fascinating range of things where, my start point of looking at it, okay, I wasn't expecting to read about that. And so it's a great tool that you use to engage people. What I thought was interesting was the context in which you talk about, what is loosely defined an argument. And if you'd said to me before I read the book that, a sort of hostage taking situation had the dynamics of an argument, I wouldn't have thought about it. And yet framed in the way that you do, I think that's fascinating. Can you talk a little bit around sort of how you define an argument and how is it all these eclectic examples fit into your sort of worldview?
Yeah. I mean, part of the trick of it is not defining it too tightly. And I thought about this a lot at the beginning. I was like, well, what exactly do I mean by disagreement or an argument? And maybe I should set that out. And after a while, I kind of thought, well, you don't actually need to. Human relationships, human communication, they're incredibly complex. It's very difficult to put boxes around things and define them tightly.
Right, because we don't suddenly go, we are now having an argument.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
We're sort of tightly defined.
Exactly. You can't really do it. And actually, by not worrying about it too much, I think I was able to do a lot of these things. I'm glad you kind of feel that it comes together because, I just thought, these guys like interrogators and hostage negotiators, and I spoke to them.
And just for the listeners, you should explain. You've gone in and, I mean, you haven't just like researched this stuff as in read about it. You've gone and done some things that have really put. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah. I mean, so I was sort of trained in, if that's not too an exaggeration, in interrogation by one of the foremost interrogation experts in the world, and he kind of put me in a mock interrogation scenario where I had to kind of interrogate a suspect, and it was absolutely horrible. I mean, it's a really, really incredibly difficult thing to do, to interrogate somebody. And the dynamics of a tough conversation, conflict-ridden conversation like that, where you're talking to a guy who doesn't want to talk to you, doesn't like you, but you need him to, doesn't want to cooperate you, but you need him to cooperate with you. That is basically the way a lot of arguments are, right? They're not interrogations exactly, in that you're not necessarily trying to get information out of somebody, but you are often in a situation where you're dealing with somebody who doesn't really want to cooperate with you, and you're trying to get them to cooperate with you on this, and you're dealing at these different levels. You have to think intellectually, cognitively about what we're talking about here, and at the same time you're assessing the relationship and the psychology and the emotion of that person and what's going on there. So your brain is working on all these different levels at once. So I think these situations can tell us a huge amount. And these guys, the expert interrogators, the hostage negotiators, also people I talk to, addiction therapists and diplomats, they're incredible experts on human nature, essentially, and on human communication. And they don't all of them, they're not all necessarily like theorists. Some of them are, like some of them have gone on to become academics and so on, but they're just guys who understand people and who are interested in how to communicate. And you can draw an immense amount of insight and wisdom from these guys, and that's hopefully a big part of the book.
And I loved it as you were talking there. I was sort of thinking, so university of life in many respects for these people, is the experiences they've had have just taught them to intuitively do things. And one of the bits I thought was really interesting, the sort of lessons you draw was around this idea of authenticity. In that, if you want to engage with other people, the idea of just following a predefined, there are lots of examples in the book where if people had just followed a predefined script, and you cite examples where they do, and it's not authentic, that is not going to help you in those particular situations. So in many respects, the skills that you're talking about here is about drawing something human out of us and responding to the situation that's in front of us. And so far from arguments being always won by logic, you have to kind of work on a very human level. And so I love this idea of sort of, the rule, the most important thing is make sure you're authentic. Don't try and just copy someone else's transcript for the situation you're in. And so you kind of, yes, you have to apply logic in certain situations, but generally speaking, it's all about being human.
Yeah. I mean, the book is completely self-contradictory in that sense. So I set out 10 rules of productive argument, right? That's basically the kind of, at least the second half of the book, that's the structure of the second half of the book. So in the first half of the book, I talk about why disagreement and conflict are so important and the immense benefits that they bring to us. In the second half, I say, here are kind of 10 rules, I might have called it 10 principles for good disagreement. But the 10th rule is basically a kind of a golden rule. And it says, look, none of this stuff matters, actually, if you don't mean it. If you're not honest. Your first rule, your kind of rule is be real. And unless you are real, then all the things I've been talking about will just become a series of packed little techniques and tricks. And, the thing about techniques and tricks is that people see through them. Like, people can tell when you're being inauthentic, right? And it's really annoying. And it's actually something that's guaranteed to make the conversation go badly. So to give you an example, interrogators, one of the lessons that I learned from interrogation was that you have to make a connection with the person that you're talking to before you get to the substance of it, right? Before you get to the tough part of the conversation. And more generally, one of the big reasons disagreements go wrong is that we get to the disagreement too quickly before we've kind of established a relationship that's on a kind of sure footing. So really good interrogators do not walk into the room, sit down and say, okay, Sonny, you need to tell me everything that you know, or we're going to throw the book at you, or whatever it is, or worse. That is almost guaranteed to shut them down, right? There's almost what they want, right? They come into this room preparing to they're prepared. They're often very trained. We're talking about like hardened terrorists that these guys deal with, to not say anything and to resist your coercion, right? And so when you say that, they're like, okay, I know this game. This is fine. I'm just going to sit here and say nothing, or or just be disruptive. But and a lot of interrogators make that mistake. The really good interrogators walk into the room and they say, look, I would just really like to understand why you're here, basically. Like how you ended up here. I want to know your story. Because it seems to me like you've had a really interesting life. So and I'm trying to get my head around what's happened. Something like that, right? And these guys, these hardened terrorists, these hardened trained terrorists, just gush, just open up. Their defenses get completely lowered, and they tell everything, including the information that the interrogator wants, right? But they tell their story. 9 times out of 10, it works when it's done really well. And one of the big points that Lawrence, the expert who I talked to a lot on this, he said, all this is useless unless you mean it. Like, really, these interrogators are really genuinely curious about this person. They're not pretending to say, hey, I'm interested in what happened to you and how you ended up here. They really want to know. And if you go in there and you try and fake it and you say, and it just comes across as a bit, they will see through that immediately, and it'll shut them down. So yeah, genuine interest, genuine empathy, genuine curiosity, all these things are immensely powerful.
And it's interesting because as you were talking there, I was thinking about movies, and I know these are extreme stereotypes for sort of dramatic effect, but you have the kind of good cop, bad cop, both of which implicitly are role playing, and then you've got kind of sort of waterboarding type techniques and the sort of extremities. That's how it's portrayed in the movie. This is how we get information out of people. And I sort of read it and I thought, well, it's a nice narrative for a movie, but it's actually sort of how we think it ought to work. And yet what you've pointed to is a much more nuanced piece that sort of says, actually, we need to, if you want to get the most out of this situation, for it to be a success, you need to come at it from a very, very different angle, which is not the one that we see in those extremities movies, but is actually one that in many respects requires you to display, you need to be in the moment, you need to be engaged. So there's a ton of effort required on your part that to feel, you have to put something into this to get the thing you want out of it. You can't just rock up and kind of hope to act your way through it. And so it's harder work in some respects than one might initially think.
Yeah, and it is harder work, and it is a kind of it's a kind of strength, mental strength that can, to some people, can seem like a lack of strength or weaknesses. It's interesting because it seems like the strong thing to do here is to say, right, I need to go in and just scare this person, right? And it's completely counterproductive. And the analogy, because at the end of the day, I'm trying to drawing this back to our more everyday situations, but in our arguments and disagreements, we often have this instinct, which is, right, I need to win this argument, and I'm going to try and dominate this conversation and basically crush this person with my reasons, and then that'll persuade them. I mean, it doesn't work, right? It's completely counterproductive. This person sees you coming at them almost like you waving these reasons as weapons, and they defend themselves, right? And they push back. And so instead of, you might think of yourself as being, really powerful arguer and but actually it's completely pointless and futile. And the strong thing to do here is actually show them that you're not trying to win the argument here. You're actually trying to get to a better place. Now, you have a point of view, all right? Isn't it? You should have a point of view and try and guide them towards it. But if you kind of act like this is about you and your status, you'll just turn this thing. You will turn this thing into a status battle, and that's when it goes wrong.
And one of the examples you quote in the book is Nelson Mandela, and the way that he engaged with people that you would have expected him to have, for very legitimate reasons, a lot of anger towards. And I was really struck by reading that and comparing that with what we seem to have in many cases nowadays on the political stage. I think, for example, of the UK, aspects in the US, there's a lot of polarization there. And I'm struck really that we have built, in many respects, political systems have discouraged the kind of thing you're talking about. So there's countries where there's coalitions, where they're used to having coalitions, and there it probably operates. But if I look at the leadership in many countries where it is literally one person wins, and it's usually one guy wins and another guy loses because of the state of where we're at with diversity and inclusion in politics. But I'm intrigued as to your thoughts around that. I mean, have we built structures that are not helping us when we think about those things?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, we've tried to build a structure, roughly, we can call it democracy, right? In which we make the most of different points of view and argument, right? So the theoretical way, and sometimes it's not completely broken, it still does work to some extent, You have different politicians representing different groups of people or different points of view in the population. They come together and they argue, and then they agree based on a vote. Who's won the argument. So that's a kind of way of structuring and making the most out of a diversity of viewpoints. It's relatively new. It's a pretty kind of new. Look at the great sweep of human history. It's a new and fragile experiment. And the reason I think it's fragile, though, is that it really goes against the grain of human nature. Like I say, we're not really built to go, okay, well, here's my point of view. Now I'm going to listen to yours, and then I'm going to shift my point of view. We're really built to say, I'm going to dominate you and destroy you, or you're going to destroy me. Or I'm just going to agree with whatever my leader says, what my group says, and I'm not going to get into to any conflicts whatsoever. This is really kind of quite a difficult thing for us to do. And so, but the current situation with the way that politics is kind of filtered through media and social media now is absolutely designed to turn everything into a power battle and a status battle, where everybody's really just kind of showing what a big person they are, playing to their own side, trying to win likes and retweets, trying to activate their base. And nobody's really engaging with the other side, or very few people are, and saying, okay, maybe you're right about this, but I think we should be going over here, and actually having a real dialogue. That's getting harder as everybody feels like they have to kind of enhance their own status in the eyes of their own followers. So I think the art of productive engagement, productive disagreement that really great politicians have, and Mandela was just an absolute genius of it, is an endangered one. And again, that's part of the reason I wanted to write the book.
And here's an interesting example, because natural logic, here's someone who's been imprisoned for most of his life and who's got a ton of reasons to hold grudges. They're very understandable. And yet that experience seems to have demonstrated precisely the point. See, that's why I think he's a great example, is he illustrates the point that he could totally have been completely and utterly even more radicalized if you take the view that he was sort of had strong views before. That experience could have really pushed him into corner. And I thought it was really interesting as I was thinking about it, thinking, well, he's sort of seen the edge, and he's seen that this is a complete waste of time, and has come out the other side and just gone, we've got to do things differently. So I think it's a beautiful sort of poster child for the book in terms of what you're suggesting, which is actually, many of us don't finish and make that journey. We kind of get stuck in, and we don't have the extremity of the experience he had by any stretch of the imagination. But he's sort of come through it, and therefore I think is a lovely illustration of the fact that actually, if you find people, and you see this, there's plenty of other extreme, so people that have really gone to the edge, who've kind of pulled back and are now the opposite, I think sort of helps and supports your point. And I was reading and reflecting, thinking it's very strange that depth of experience won't take you there, but that maybe that's what it takes to be able to really see that you won't affect change by continuing down that path.
Yeah, that's a really great way of thinking about it. Mandela, when he came out of prison, he was in a power sharing arrangement until, for a couple of years, until they had elections. But really, from that point on, he was sort of president-elect. And because they knew that when the election happened, he was going to be president. And he could have absolutely attempted, with a lot of justification, attempted to crush the white radicals who are opposing his ascendancy. We talk about white supremacists a lot now. I think the term is used quite loosely. I mean, believe me, these were real white supremacists, and they were arming themselves in vast numbers. And they were led by some pretty serious people. Now, and these people and their allies had destroyed the greater part of Mandela's life. Right? They put him in prison. They'd taken him away from his family. He didn't get to see his children grow up. It's pretty. And he was very open with them about how terrible that was, right? So he didn't kind of pretend that was all fine. But what he did, which was really extraordinary, was he also saw the good in them, right? In Afrikaner culture, in sort of white South African culture, and he brought out the best in them, right? Not all of them perhaps would have been susceptible to this, but when he saw the opportunity to do so, he became very good friends with the prison guards, right? And they, he was sort of godfather to their children. He learned the Afrikaans language. He learned about the history of the people, the culture. Like he really kind of sought to understand his enemy, if you like, and to see the good side of them as well as the bad side. And that was the thing. Ultimately, I won't kind of tell the story that I tell in the book, but that was the thing that enabled him to unite the country when he came out of prison, because he was able to say to these guys who were tooling up basically and getting ready for a war. He was able to say to their leaders, "Look, I understand you." And he spoke to them in their language, and he said, "I understand you. I know that there's a lot of nobility and dignity in you and in your culture, and I actually don't want to fight with you. I want you to be part of this nation. This is not about us versus them. This is not about blacks dominating, taking over whites. This is about a nation of black and white people coming together, right, and starting to put the past behind us." Now, can you imagine that happening on any scale in any situation today, right? We just don't go, "Oh, okay, you've done this really bad thing, or you stand for this really bad. But I think you're a good person also, and maybe we can just have this conversation." So, "No, you're a terrible person. You're a racist. You're a white supremacist, or whatever it is, But basically, you are not worthy of me even talking to you or engaging with you." And often we're talking about people who are nowhere near on the scale of heinous, the kind of the awfulness of the people that Mandela was dealing with, by the way. We just dismiss people out of hand, even if their views are, a few inches to the right or left of our own, right? Let alone whether or not they're gearing up to destroy us, like physically, as they were in the case of Mandela. So it's just a completely different model and a different way of thinking about how to handle these really tough conflicts. Yeah, I'm afraid we got ourselves into this kind of mindset now, which is either this kind of with us or against us mindset, where either you're on my side, or if you're not, I just think you're completely disgusting and beyond the pale and a terrible person, and I don't want to see, hear, or engage with you whatsoever.
Right, which if someone played back to us would, we know intuitively that we're very unlikely to respond positively. And yet that seems to be the visceral reaction. It's kind of like, I'm going to, that's how I'll view them. But if somebody dared to look at us in the same light, be like, "What do you mean? This outrageous way to perceive me." So I think it's funny that we intuitively understand this and yet still find ourselves capable of behaving in a manner that is unhelpful to sort of furthering, collaborative.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think just drawing it again back down to the kind of micro scale or the kind of everyday scale, that principle that you've just said is a really important one and a really hard one to do. But you should always be thinking, if somebody was talking to me like this, how would I respond? And often you only have to ask yourself the question and think it through to realize that. So, I quite often, when I get into even, arguments with people on social media or maybe on email, because often these conditions, by the way, are not conducive to good disagreement. But you see people kind of like behaving with sarcasm or sneering at you, or, as they're making their point of view, kind of condescending, or sarcasm is quite a frequent one. And I'm thinking, how do you expect I'm going to react here? Like, am I going to go, "Wow, yeah, that's a really witty put down of me you made there. I really appreciate it." I'm going to get annoyed. But then, I can sense myself doing it sometimes to the other person. I think, well, what's the point of this? And ultimately, when you're stuck in these kind of slightly hostile, sort of tough, slightly unpleasant disagreements, I think you have a couple of options. One of them is to walk away, right? That's always an option. I don't say in the book, every disagreement can be productive. Sometimes you're just dealing with somebody who's not. It does take some degree of cooperation.
I like that as well, by the way, because I was reading it and going, yeah, but what about? And then you kind of blindsided me with of course, there are some people with whom it is not worth having an argument. I was like,
absolutely. Sometimes you just can say, well, that's it. But what I say in the book is actually that's a smaller number of people than you think. Like often the person that's being unpleasant or annoying, whatever, can be brought round, right? And so there are things you can do to a phrase I use in the book is to create your own adversary, right? The way you behave and the way you talk will influence them directly in how they're behaving, right? Sometimes you can try that, right? You can model what it's like to be in a good disagreement, and that will help. Sometimes it won't, but actually quite often it does. So, and the person who starts out being really disruptive and difficult can be calmed down and brought into dialogue. One of the things you have to ask yourself when somebody is being seemingly irrational or unpleasant or whatever is, why? What's going on here? This is probably because they're feeling that their status is threatened, right? We've been talking about this throughout. A lot of the reason disagreements go wrong is that people feel like they're under threat in some way. Their reputation is under threat. Okay, so how can I find a way to reassure them about that, right? Maybe I need to say something nice about them or compliment them in front of the room, point out some really good work they've done or something they've got right. That's just going to lower their defenses and maybe get this conversation back on an even keel. Yeah, so to some extent, I think you can create the opponent that you want, even when that, even when it doesn't start well.
And I was you sort of started to address that. I'm really intrigued by what writing the book has done to you. And I'm sure the answer is you now follow your rules to the letter. But I'm intrigued, has it changed? Well, clearly it will have done, but sort of in what ways has it changed your perspective? Have you found yourself, was some of this stuff easier than you were expecting? Is some of it much harder? How's it sort of changed your approach to life and interactions with other people?
I would say it's definitely made me more open, more likely to just disagree directly, to raise the thing that I sort of want to say, but haven't hitherto said because I'm sort of nervous of getting into it. It's made me less nervous about disagreeing, basically, because basically, I should have said at the beginning, but I'm not somebody who enjoys conflict. I probably am really quite conflict averse, or have been, and just learning about how to do it well and understanding why it goes wrong and what the other person is likely to be thinking and feeling when I start the disagreement, right? All these things just have put me more at ease about getting it out there, and also just learning how important it is to have these disagreements, right? So it's made me less stressed about it. It's made me kind of able to have these disagreements in a way that I hope conveys that I'm not stressed about it, and that means the other person these are dynamics, right? And so when you do it, and it doesn't seem like you're particularly stressed about it, that often kind of calms the other person down, and the whole thing doesn't kind of scale out of control. And even in my home life, I'm happy, more kind of happy about or slightly more eager to just have things out with my wife. Not like I don't want to
not like spoiling for a fight every time you meet up. But yeah.
But I think it's quite important to have not lots, but you need to have low stakes disagreements about things. You need to practice like anything else, because that means that when the big arguments come up, you're actually much better prepared to have them, because you're kind of you're in the groove of having your differences aired, right? So actually, I do think, and in the book, that there's a chapter on relationships and couples that shows that the couples who have their arguments out, often quite heated arguments, are actually the couples who are more likely to stay together and to be happy. So that was kind of one big learning. And also, we have children, young children, and just a little thing, but I'm kind of more at ease with arguing, not in a horrible way, but in a kind of fairly light way with my wife in front of the children. I'll have the disagreement about whatever it is, whatever we're talking about, running the house, where we're going to go at the weekend, whatever. It sometimes can be quite direct, but in front of the children, rather than saying, we need to talk about this behind closed doors, as if disagreement is some sort of horrible, shameful thing that we shouldn't kind of infect children with.
Right,
and
right.
That's actually mad. I want them to grow up thinking disagreement and argument is perfectly good, healthy part of relationships, and it doesn't mean that you're unhappy or things are going badly. And I think they have learned that. They've actually learned that rather too well. They're very, very willing to get into arguments with me.
I was going to say, because I can imagine actually your books for your kids could be real lethal weapons, right? So lying is good. Keep asking why and being a pain in the butt asking questions. And now confrontation is worth going for. So you may have potentially created a sort of learning library that's not necessarily helpful.
Yeah, you're right. Horrible thought, but yeah.
That was good in adult hands, bad in kids' hands would be the sort of basic logic. But I love that idea of normalizing and flexing your muscles, because you're absolutely right. Anything we don't do that often, by default, worst case is you're crap at it. Best case is you're not as good as you could be, and we know this intuitively. And yet, I've now got fears about I will now feel the need every day to have an argument. But maybe actually there is a point where maybe I am having disagreements and arguments. It's like, if I'm having normal interactions with people, these things will come along, and maybe I should view them as opportunities to flex that mental muscle, as opposed to a thing to be avoided.
That's exactly right. And more generally, the physical exercise analogy is quite a good one, because there is an element, even when it becomes less stressful and you're kind of more used to it, there's an element of discomfort, right? There's an element of tension. There should be, right, in a proper disagreement. But it's like exercise, right? You very rarely enjoy exercise. Well, that's just me. But exercise is often uncomfortable and difficult, and sometimes really, it's physically stressful, right? And sometimes quite painful when you're doing it, but you do it anyway, and you feel good about the fact that you're doing it, because it has these longer term payoffs, these longer term benefits. I think of disagreement the same way. It can be uncomfortable and intense in the moment, but you should do it because it has these immense benefits to the relationship with the people that you're disagreeing with, and to your mind and everything else.
Fantastic stuff. Look, I could keep talking to you forever. It's been, as ever, highly enlightening. Before you go, I do want to also flag up your newsletter, which is one of those things that joyously plops into my inbox. And I wanted to just kind of explore that with you and just tell my listeners what they can expect when they subscribe.
Oh, yeah. Well, you might be, again, better at describing that than me, because it's slightly hard to... Okay, so the newsletter is called The Ruffian, and it's a Substack newsletter. And at least every couple of weeks, often every week, slightly, sometimes it's every week, sometimes it's every couple of weeks, I curate a bunch of things that I've been finding interesting, often to do with the news, but not always, and just write a few little pieces about them. It's quite eclectic. It draws on some of the things that I'm interested in, like psychology and communication and so on. And I just try and give you a kind of cut down, version of what's been going on or what's going on at the moment. That you with points of view on things that I just don't think you're likely to get anywhere else, at least not all of them together. So yeah, I don't know. How would you describe it?
No, I was intrigued because I sort of thought, again, I was struggling a bit to go, what is the overarching theme here? And it's kind of Ian's musings on the world. But it's always but in a really positive sense. And clearly if I thought it was terrible, I wouldn't be talking about it. But it's fascinating for me because I just sort of I find it nice brain food for the when it arrives, and I kind of go, oh, that's interesting. And there's some stuff I disagree with, some stuff I agree with, but it's always thought provoking, and that for me is always the biggest compliment. I like people that engage, and you write clearly very, very well, so that's engaged. But it was almost the inspiration for the eclecticness, because I honestly don't know what I'm going to get when I open it, and that's part of the joy. because very often you sort of, something's plop in my inbox and I kind of know direction of travel. Whereas this, I genuinely have no idea what you're going to say. It might be something really minor that sort of you come across or stuff I wasn't even aware of. And that I thought was really interesting, is that your format is very, very fluid. And I like the fact that there isn't a regular cadence, because it sort of then is much more of an unexpected gift. And I think in a world where we try and predict everything, having something that's a little bit unexpected brings a little bit of joy.
Yeah, it's or a slightly darker way to put it. It's like a Skinner box, where you get these kind of irregular rewards. But yeah, I think brain food is probably the best way to do it. So it's best thing to call it. It's like, here's a collection of, because often they're like links with short notes to things that I have found incredibly interesting, and I'll say why I find them interesting or what they've made me think about. So yeah, it's just a bit of brain stimulation dropping into your inbox every week or two.
Fantastic. Well, look, Ian, thank you so much for your time. I will put links to all of your books, including Conflicted, in the show notes and your newsletter as well. But it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, one, for just being curious and encouraging us to try things that I think, when you explain them to are incredibly valuable, but doing it in such an engaging and thoughtful manner. Thank you so much for, one, writing, and secondly, for being on the podcast.
That's very kind. Thank you very much, Christian. Really enjoyed it.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Ian for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Conflicted, Ian's other books, and to sign up for his thoroughly excellent newsletter, The Ruffian, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major platforms. If you like the show and haven't yet left a 5-star review for it, please do so. It really does help. To find out more about Human Risk, the work I do with my clients, and for details of the Human Risk video blog, blogs, and newsletter, visit human-risk.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, enjoy your conflict, and thanks for listening.